Do we have a special guest for you today? Jamie Mittelman is an entrepreneur featured in US Insider, Apple Plus, and CEO Weekly, making sure girls from all corners of the world have athletic role models where they can look up to who they look like and sound like them. She is the founder of Flame Bearers, the world's first media production and content company for elite women athletes, mainly who are Olympians and Paralympians, telling stories via an award-winning podcast, video production, and live events. Flame Bearers has won international acclaimed awards in the categories of diversity, equity, and inclusion, public service, and sports, and has a global reach in 48 countries. Jamie's background is in media, having managed a $30 million portfolio for things like Yahoo, the Huffington Post, and Verizon. She founded Flame Bearers while receiving her master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School, where she received the Don K. Price Award for her significant impact on the Harvard community. At Harvard, Jamie co-founded the Women in Power Conference and furthered her knowledge in public-private partnerships. Prior to Harvard, Jamie received her master's in business administration from Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business, where she was also recognized for her contributions to the Tuck community. Take a listen.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to talk with you.
I'm really excited to be here too, Ashley. Thanks for having me.
And one of the things that we love to dive in on here, especially, is moments of spark or inspiration, things that really transformed you and your role and your leadership. And I want to start with where you are now and you being the founder of Flame Bearers, which is a media production company, always amplifying the voices of women, specifically Olympians and Paralympians. Starting there, what really inspired you to create this platform?
It's such a good question, Ashley. I think it really started from a need and a frustration with the lack of current coverage, to be honest. So if we look at the sports media landscape as a whole, 85% of sports coverage goes to male athletes. So that means that less than 15% of all sports coverage out there goes to women. And of that 15%, it pretty much goes to a very narrow portion of the pie, normally white, able-bodied women from the global north who play a specific sport. And I realized that there's so many women out there who were not getting the coverage that I believe they deserved. And as a result, there was a whole generation of young girls and boys who were growing up without role models who looked like them. So I really wanted to be a part of providing those role models for athletes from all corners of the globe to show young girls and boys that they can do it at the highest level of sport.
I love that. And you're so right, because I think for so many young people, when they watch the news or are scrolling and they see some of the same stories or the same people being highlighted, right? It can have an impact on how you interact and view the world. What I'm interested in, because you've already talked to so many, incredible people, was there a
Yeah.
particular athlete story or messaging or history, something that really resonated with you the most and maybe shifted, your view on sports and leadership?
It's yes. It's interesting. My view on this actually came from my first job out of college, not in sports at all. When I realized I was working for the first liberal arts school in Asia, I was living in Bangladesh at the time, and there was two different lines of thought around how you fundraised. It was, how do you portray the narrative of the students? And the two lines of thought were, one, you portray them with what I call kind of the pity brush, that these are disenfranchised girls who are struggling, who, we've all seen the old school UNICEF ads with flies on their faces, and it's kind of this pitying portrayal. The other school of thought was, no, these are future leaders who are strong, determined, super capable, super smart, overcoming hurdles. And what I quickly realized was, no one likes to be painted in a disempowering way. You want to own your narrative and view yourself as a leader, as someone who is coming to the table with skills, with power. And what that told me, and this was such an incredible experience for me to have right out of the gate after school, was that it's really important for when you communicate stories that the narrative actually rings true to the person in the story. And so often we have narratives being co-opted, we have plot lines being twisted. So, there's more clicks. And that may be short-term beneficial, but long-term, it's actually just completely wrong in my perspective. I like to put the athletes and the individuals who are in the story at the center of every story, and tell their stories on their terms, because I've seen so many different individuals feel like their words are being twisted or taken from them. Um, we've frequently seen this, and with a lot of female athletes, particularly when it comes to women of color, who have their stories kind of being taken from them, who have their words really twisted in ways where they're pitted against each other when that's not at all actually what's happening.
Absolutely. And it's something that I think, and I wish that people talked about more, because your insight here, I feel like a lot of times that's not mentioned or spoken about.
No, people are like, great job. There's women's sports coverage out there. And yes, that is one step. I think the other part that people are not talking about is, what does that women's sports coverage actually look like? Is all coverage good coverage? And to that, I would say absolutely not. There's actually coverage out there that's really harmful and detrimental to the athletes. And quantity matters in terms of 15% and trying to increase that portion of the pie. But the quality of coverage and how those stories are told, I think, is equally important. And that's where I think most people miss the boat.
Absolutely. And speaking of your work, when you first started to get into this space, can you take us back to maybe college or a little bit before? I'm always curious about the journey, sort of what that looked like. Like what was your point before you became this activist and leader in women in sports and the flame bearers? What did that process
Sure.
look like?
Sure. So growing up, sport was a huge part of my life. It was one of my greatest teachers. It's where I had some of my highest highs, also some of my most cringeworthy, awkward, embarrassing moments where, I missed a shot in soccer, or I fell in ski racing, or I dropped the baton in track and field. But I think throughout all of it was joy. Sport was a source of joy for me. It was a place where I learned, and it was a place where I grew. And I love the fact that it was a universal language throughout all of it. It didn't matter if you were with someone from a different community who was of a different faith, who spoke a different language. Sport brought people together. Flash forward, I played a little bit of soccer in college. I knew I was not going to be a professional athlete, much to the chagrin of 5-year-old me, who wanted to be a professional soccer player. Wasn't in the cards for me. But I quickly realized that there was a couple things that I did have that I thought could be leveraged for other people. I was a great convener in terms of bringing people together. I was a safe space for people to tell their stories, and an advocate for others. And then 3 is, I think historically people have thought of me as a clear and effective communicator, and that allowed me to be a good advocate for them. So it's kind of funny. I never envisioned myself being on the other side, giving voice to athletes. But when I look back on my career, I think it kind of brought those 3 different sides to me together. So I'm really honored that I have the ability to help amplify and give voice to these athletes. I mentioned that I started off as a teacher working in Bangladesh. I thought that that was going to be the way that I gave voice to others, that I help support others. I quickly realized that while I loved being a teacher, I wanted to have impact outside of the 15 students in my classroom. And I thought that through marketing, through media, that I could reach more people. And it's really interesting because today, at least in the context of the United States, everyone is talking about media being used for ill, for negative reasons, misinformation and disinformation. But the reason I got into my work is because I think media can also be used for good. It can change perceptions. You can shape how people think. You can open their minds. You can challenge narratives around what it means to be A, B, or C. And I quickly realized that I wanted to meld my love of media with my love of sports.
I love that. And I want to take a moment too to think about your approach because, you mentioned a bit earlier about, sharing the stories of these athletes and talking about their journeys. And oftentimes, athletes have stories just like the rest of us that they face, physical, emotional challenges, and they can lead to, they're sensitive topics sometimes, right? And so I'm curious, your approach to this work. A lot of young women that listen to this are so interested in journalism and are interested in helping to craft narratives. But how do you ensure that voices are being represented in the way that they want to be represented? What does that look like? What's your approach?
I absolutely love that question. And I think not enough people ask that question. So, first and foremost, we don't come in with an agenda that we're trying to push. Every time we approach an athlete, one of the first questions we ask them is, do you have something in particular that you want to focus on? If not, we can provide tips and some guidance, but we really provide kind of the blank canvas for the athlete to say, these are the subjects that I am really drawn to. Throughout the entire process, we also have continuous check-ins with the athlete where we say, before we start an interview, here's the draft questions. If there's any questions you don't want to answer, we won't do them. At the end of the interview, they have complete sign-off rights. So nothing is going live without their stamp of approval saying, yes, I approve this message. And if there's something in there that they don't like, we redo it. And I think this is really important for historically marginalized communities who do feel like they're, and rightly so, there's mistrust. There's a lot of people who feel like they have put themselves out there, or they've seen their parents put themselves out there, and they're burned. And that is not what we want. So it's really important for us to put in that extra legwork so the athletes know that we're really on their side, that nothing is going to go live without their approval, and that frankly, we have their back.
This year was such a big year and continues to be a big year for women in sports and everything that's happening, right? With, you have Caitlin Clark, Simone Biles, all of these really important movements and moments. At the same time, female athletes continue to face challenges, visibility, pay equity, all of these things. So what have you seen now as someone who really has seen all these sides and all these stories? What are some of the things you've seen as the biggest barriers standing in the way for women in sports? And what do you think that we need to do to help break down some of those barriers?
That's such a big question. I love it. So women's sports are definitely having kind of what people call a moment. We exist because we want that moment to be every single day. We don't want this to be a blip in the radar that people look back on and are like, oh, remember 2024 with March Madness? No, we want this to be what it is like every single day. I think there's a couple of things that have historically stood in the way of women's sports. You mentioned pay equity. The vast majority of professional female athletes have secondary and tertiary jobs. If you're an athlete with a physical disability, a lot of them are actually living below the poverty line. So these are the best athletes in the world who are just struggling to get by. This matters because historically there's been significant lack of sponsorship. We've seen this with the Paralympics, but also lack of media coverage. So the Tokyo Paralympics were actually the first time in the US history where the Paralympics were shown on modern day television. Now, this matters because if you're a para athlete and you're trying to get sponsors usually respond to audiences. If you can say, I have X thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of followers, brands are then going to want to tap into that support and support it. So historical lack of media coverage and viewership for sure. We're also seeing changing societal expectations. So if we flash back, and this is going to sound crazy and super archaic, 1900 was the first year that women we're allowed to even compete in the modern day Olympics. And you would think that that's 124 years ago, but we were only allowed to compete in 6 sports. And the sports we could compete in were the ones that were quote unquote feminine enough. So these are sports like horseback riding, croquet, tennis. This past Olympics was the first Olympics with gender parity in terms of equal numbers of males and females participating. So we are getting there. There is still a long way to go. I think that, this is not to blame the victim, but I think that there's also things that individuals can do. I think that a lot of people, myself formerly included in this, used to put all the blame on companies and say, hey, you're not showing them, you're not paying them. And there is absolutely a very real role and responsibility that those corporations have. What I would like to also challenge people to think about is that we as individuals, as fans, have an opportunity to change the narrative too. And I think that people, myself formerly included, we're quick to kind of get off the hook on that. 3 things that I think every single person can do. So, number one is actually go to games. So, tune in. If you have a local team, go to their actual games and bring your kids. So, if you're a parent, bring your children with you. So, I grew up a Boston Red Sox fan because my parents took me to Red Sox games. So in Boston with the new professional women's soccer team, I'm going to bring my future kids to those games so they grow up fans of that team. So number one is actually go to the games. And if you don't have a local team, no problem, watch them on TV. Number two would be to buy their merch. So a lot of professional athletes have merchandise, jerseys with their names on the back. Buy it because a portion of those proceeds tends to usually go to the athletes. Simultaneously, if there's not merch, a lot of female athletes like Allison Felix, Ezine Kalu, have startups, their own businesses, buy their products. So for example, Allison Felix has a line of sneakers built for women's bodies. They're my favorite sneakers that I own. I love my size sneakers. Ezine Kalu has a lipstick line. I love her lipstick. Her lipstick is all about how do I create sweat-proof lipstick that's not going to come off when I'm playing basketball. That money goes directly into the athlete's pockets. So you don't have to be a media mogul to do that. Go online, buy their products. Number 3, this is a small one, but follow and engage with them on social media. This matters because advertisers directly respond to followership numbers. So I always like to call out those 3 actions because I think sometimes it's easy for all of us to feel powerless. And I think it's important to realize that, yes, systemic change needs to happen. We can simultaneously work on our own actions while we're working towards that bigger goal.
I'm so excited that you outlined those ways because I think people, you're right, we always shift to something else. Like we need to hold each other accountable and really do what we can. Like one example is that, I went to Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, and my friend and I were talking about going to some game. And of course, the first game that popped up, they were like, oh, Pitt football. But the Pitt women's volleyball team is number 1 in the country.
Go to that.
You should go to that. Right? And they're amazing to watch. And they're the ones, that are really some of the best athletes on campus. So that to me is like that big thing of like, no, let's go to that. Let's experience that.
Yeah.
It's a key example.
That's so cool. And that's exactly right. And it's not an either or situation. It's a yes and it's a I can do this individual action while simultaneously holding this corporation to account and saying, hey, I noticed there was bias in this reporter's talking. I noticed that there was a lack of coverage while simultaneously going to that Pitt volleyball game. I think that's a great example.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I sort of want to pivot here to you and your vision as you're creating so much space for women to tell their stories and empowering women. What's your vision for Flame Bears in the next five years? What's your vision? What are some of your goals and impact you want to make?
Yeah. My vision is that Flame Bearers becomes the go-to media production company of elite women in sports. So when people think of stories around the best women athletes in the world, they think of our brand. They're not thinking about sports reporting. So we're not thinking about, who's going to be who in the upcoming game. We're talking about human interest stories. So what makes these women who they are? What are the characteristics of leadership? What gets them up in the morning? What's their why? And I want to continue producing content in three main formats. So that's video, podcasting, and live events. And I want us to be a really steady presence globally. Right now, we've worked with over 200 different Olympians and Paralympians from 52 countries, but our main audience is definitely in the United States and Canada. That's great. I want to broaden that work. And I think that's important because in a lot of countries, they don't have the systemic support that female athletes do in the United States. So I think it's been great to start here at home, but I want to make sure that we're felt internationally too.
I love it. And we'll continue, of course, to link our your pages in the bios and such, but I think you should add to that list in terms of what people can do is to listen to all of your amazing content because it's so amazing. And I've learned so much. And the way, I know before for this talk, we were, when we were connecting with each other, I love your outlook on all of this and it's positive and it's infectious and it's an exciting time. And this is why I like this last question I have for you, and I always ask it, and I say that it for some people it's an odd question, but I think it's an interesting question. So all about the work that we do with this podcast is all about unleashing your inner queen. Because when a pawn gets to the other side of the chessboard, you can get any piece you want back. More often than not, people pick a queen, and it's that transformative power, the pawn becoming the queen. So my question for you is, what does unleashing your inner queen mean to you? And off of that, how do you unleash your inner queen?
So let me start with the first part. Unleashing my inner queen means running towards what makes me scared. So I think there's a common misconception that being fearless means that you don't have fears. I like to debunk that and say, nope, everyone is terrified. It's what you do with it that matters. So it's being that pawn marching down the board and saying, yes, I could be taken out any second by a bishop, by a rook, but knowing that I'm going to continue to march forward. In my line of work, it is not letting societal expectations, people judging me, whatever, hold me back from continuing to do the work that I want to do. So that is the first part. Remind me of the second part of the question again?
Yeah, how do you unleash your inner queen?
Oh, okay. So the women I work with get all the credit here. So to be honest, I still have to pinch myself that I get to do this job. It's absolutely crazy to me. And I think one of the really cool things is I get to be a synthesizer of all their stories. I get to hear them and take them in and try and make sense of it. And in doing so, I hear themes across all of them. And one of the themes that I like to amplify is that everyone's not going to be a world-class athlete, but we all have the ability to have many of the traits that make these Olympians and Paralympians the best athletes in the world. And I think that I find my inner queen by tapping into those traits of resilience, traits of teamwork, traits of positive mental talk. And I think that everyone has the ability, whether you're an athlete, whether you've never, ever played a sport for a day in your life, to find your inner Paralympian, your inner Olympian in whatever field you are, because at the end of the day, they're characteristics and values that make them successful.
Oh, love that. Love that. It's so inspiring. And I'm just so excited for everything that you're leading and this movement. So thank you for all that you do. And also thank you for taking the time and spending some time with us and sharing your story and all the amazing things that you do.
Well, thank you for having me. Right back at you. I love what you have built and are continuing to build. And I think that there's definitely a lot of similarities in terms of supporting women and uplifting each other. So thank you.